Tonight, we uncover a story buried beneath centuries of faith, a rivalry older than any religion, and a secret that may change everything we think we know about divine power. They say the walls of Rome hold every secret, but some are buried far deeper, hidden beneath the echoing marble of the Vatican, where whispers become scripture and shadows learn to kneel. You move through St. Peter's Square at dusk when the air smells faintly of stone dust and candle wax, and the pigeons have stopped pretending to be holy doves. Somewhere above, bells mark the hour, that heavy bronze heartbeat that never seems entirely human. You pause at the obelisk, dragged from the sands of Egypt to stand like a stolen memory, and realize that the Vatican has always collected not just relics but stories that refuse to die. The guards at the gate glance your way, half bored, half suspicious, as if every tourist might be a theologian in disguise. You step inside, past frescoes that grin down at you with too many eyes, past saints whose fingers point not upward, but toward something unseen beneath your feet. Beneath these stones, rumor says, lies a chamber built before Peter himself was crucified, and inside it rests a prophecy so controversial that only 3 popes have ever dared to read it aloud. One of them, according to the fringe corners of history, never woke up the next morning. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I like imagining this story being whispered across 1,000 glowing screens, all at once. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because you're standing in the world's smallest country, staring at the world's largest secret, and it's about to start breathing. They call it the prophecy of the Black Pope, a phrase that sounds like Gothic fiction until you realize it's been quietly recorded in Jesuit letters for centuries. The term Black Pope itself, as you'll learn, isn't about skin or race, but about robes. The Superior General of the Society of Jesus traditionally wears black, while the Pope wears white, 2 sides of a holy coin that is never quite agreed on which way it should land. You walk down a narrow corridor lined with portraits of past popes, faces carved in oil and time, and you notice how some of them seem to look directly at you, while others seem to be looking through you. A whisper of incense curls in the air, sweet and sharp, almost like the scent of something burning that shouldn't be. Somewhere beneath your shoes lies the necropolis, a labyrinth of graves and corridors where early Christians buried their dead in secret, back when Rome still fed lions more eagerly than the poor. The Vatican built upward, layer upon layer, until it became not just a place of prayer, but of concealment. That's the mainstream history, the one you can read in any textbook. But tonight, you're not here for the mainstream. You're here for the draft beneath the altar, the one that smells like dust and prophecy. A guard's footsteps echo faintly behind you, then fade. Maybe he turned down another hall, or maybe you just stopped existing in the same time as him. You find a small bronze door with no handle, marked only by a Latin phrase that roughly translates to, "What begins in silence must end in silence." You've read that inscription before, once in a footnote from a declassified 19th century letter written by a Jesuit missionary named Father Carafa. He claimed the phrase was carved above a hidden archive that stored the writings of the unrecorded popes. Historians usually dismiss Carafa's story as nonsense, a product of malaria and too much devotion, but his letters do exist. One, currently housed in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, contains a marginal note in faded ink, Nigro Papae Prophetia, ultima est. The prophecy of the Black Pope is the last. Scholars still argue over what he meant. Some say it was metaphor, a poetic reference to sin consuming holiness. Others claim it refers to an actual document sealed during the Counter-Reformation, predicting the rise of a pope from the Jesuit order who would preside over the Church's final age. You feel the floor cool beneath your hand as you steady yourself against the wall, tracing centuries-old cracks that smell faintly of iron and old rain. Somewhere deep below, an air vent hums like a sleeping organ. The Vatican isn't quiet, it just pretends to be. Even the silence here is choreographed. You move again, the echo of your steps folding into the vastness of the basilica's bones. A plaque near the crypt mentions San Pietro in Vincoli, the chains of St. Peter, relics that supposedly held him in a Roman dungeon before his execution. A mainstream historical fact, those chains were indeed displayed in the basilica, forged together centuries later to symbolize unity, but modern metallurgical tests revealed they came from two completely different eras. Someone, somewhere, had welded history together. That's the Vatican in one sentence. Beautiful forgery for the sake of faith. Above you, the dome swallows the night sky, a masterpiece by Michelangelo that nearly broke the man's mind before it was finished. He once called it a cage for heaven, though the quote is usually softened in official transcripts. The gold mosaics shimmer faintly, reflecting candlelight that seems to know more secrets than the priests who lit them. A shadow crosses one of the arches. For a moment, it looks like a man in dark robes. Then it's gone. The mind makes patterns, the same way faith makes meaning, but both tend to overachieve after midnight. You descend a staircase barely wide enough for one person, winding into the heart of the Vatican's underbelly. The walls here are no longer marble, but rough stone, older than Rome itself, older perhaps than the word Rome. A fringe tidbit you once read flashes in your mind. Early pagan shrines existed on this very hill long before Peter, and some archaeologists quietly speculate that the church's foundation was chosen because it had already been sacred, for Jupiter, or maybe for something nameless. That's the kind of detail the Vatican prefers you to forget. At the bottom of the stairs, a metal gate blocks your way. The lock looks centuries old, but the security camera above it definitely isn't. You smile. Faith evolves. Surveillance just updates faster. You can almost hear a faint dripping sound from beyond the bars, like water counting down the seconds until revelation. A voice in your head, or maybe just the echo of a tour guide from years ago, recites, "Every pope buries another pope, but the church never buries a secret." You wonder how many have tried to find this place, and how many found only labyrinths that led them back to the surface. In 1590, the Jesuits were at their height. Educators, scientists, missionaries, and sometimes spies. The superior general then, Claudio Acquaviva, was called the Black Pope even by his enemies, a man whose influence stretched so far that kings wrote to him directly. That's the historical fact. The Jesuits truly became so powerful that they were accused of forming a church within the church. They were eventually suppressed in 1773, reinstated decades later, like a ghost recalled for unfinished business. You reach through the bars and touch the metal, colder than the air around it. A faint vibration hums beneath your fingers, and you realize it's the sound of machinery, a generator maybe, or something much older wearing modern disguise. If there's a prophecy hidden here, it must be patient, because centuries have passed, and yet it hasn't run out of breath. Scholars debate whether the Black Pope is meant to represent corruption within faith or the balance that keeps it from imploding. Some insist it's a misinterpretation of St. Malachi's prophecy. Others argue it's an entirely separate legend born from the Jesuits' reputation for absolute obedience. The open scholarly debate still divides theologians. Was the last pope meant literally or spiritually, as the end of institutional religion and the rebirth of something purer? No one agrees, and the Vatican isn't volunteering clarification. You can almost respect that. Mystery ages well in marble. A breeze curls through the corridor, carrying the faint scent of ozone, like the moment before a storm. You tilt your head. Maybe it's your imagination, but for a heartbeat you swear you hear chanting. Low, rhythmic, Latin phrases half swallowed by distance. You follow the sound until it fades into nothing, replaced by your own breathing. The Vatican feels alive down here, like an organism digesting time. Somewhere, A light flickers, and the walls seem to pulse, not with electricity, but with memory. You remember reading that during World War II, the Vatican sheltered thousands of refugees, some hidden in these very tunnels. One Jesuit diary described them as ghosts of nations waiting for resurrection. The metaphor fits tonight too. As you turn back toward the main hall, you catch sight of a small crest carved into the wall. 2 crossed keys and a star within a circle. It's not part of the usual Vatican iconography. You take out your phone for light, and the emblem glints faintly. The star isn't 5-pointed but 8, a symbol once used by early alchemists for regeneration. Maybe coincidence, maybe foreshadowing. You glance up, half expecting another camera, but instead you see a small crack running the length of the ceiling, seeping dust like fine ash. The whole place feels suspended between revelation and collapse. You pause to rest your hand on the stone railing, tracing grooves worn by centuries of believers, or trespassers, depending on perspective. You can almost feel the pulse of the city above, muffled and distant, like Rome itself is asleep. Your voice echoes softly as you whisper the name Negro Papai. The air shifts. Nothing dramatic, just a soft pressure, like someone inhaling nearby. The feeling passes, and you can't help but smile at your own nerves. Even skeptics behave differently underground. When you finally climb back toward the surface, the night air feels too clean, too modern, as if you've stepped out of a painting. The fountains in St. Peter's Square whisper against the marble, and the obelisk throws a long shadow that points directly toward the Apostolic Palace. Somewhere inside those walls, a man in white is sleeping, or praying, or pretending not to hear the same rumors you've just followed. Above the palace, the moon hangs pale and indifferent, a witness to every secret Rome refuses to burn. You glance once more at the basilica's facade, its statues standing like guards of eternity, and wonder how many of them know the truth. If the prophecy of the Black Pope is real, it isn't just written in Latin or hidden in archives. It's etched into the rhythm of the Church itself, the balance between light and dark, faith and power, silence and confession. And tonight, whether you realize it or not, you've taken the first step toward breaking that balance. You walk away from the square, footsteps echoing on cobblestones older than empire, and behind you, the bells begin to toll again, as if the city has been waiting for permission to breathe. Each chime rolls across the rooftops, through the alleys, into the dreams of those who sleep under painted ceilings. Somewhere, perhaps in another country, another listener is hearing this story at the same time as you, and the sound between you both is the heartbeat of prophecy itself. Slow, patient, almost kind. The Vatican will wake tomorrow as if nothing happened. But tonight, the secret has remembered its own name, and it whispers it softly into the Roman dark. Negro Papai. You wake beneath the echo of bells, the kind that seem to ring not just through the air but through your bones, and for a moment you can't tell whether they're outside or inside your head. Morning in Rome smells of wet stone and burnt espresso, that holy combination of caffeine and carbon that has probably powered more theology than divine inspiration ever did. You cross the courtyard near the old Borgo district where the Jesuit order once kept their earliest quarters, the stones worn by centuries of black-soled shoes that moved with military precision. The Society of Jesus was never meant to be mysterious, not exactly. It began as a simple brotherhood of study and service, founded by a soldier who traded his sword for scripture. That's the mainstream version, neat enough for textbooks and tourism. But behind that holy biography is a man whose mind worked more like a general than a saint. Ignatius of Loyola, the original Black Pope before anyone used the term, was obsessed with obedience the way artists are obsessed with light. He believed the soul could be trained like a regiment, and you, walking through his echo, can almost hear the faint rhythm of boots beneath the cobblestones, marching toward destiny wrapped in Latin. They called their leader the Superior General, but in whispered circles, the nickname Black Pope stuck, not from skin or sin, but from power. The power to command priests across continents, to found schools that educated princes and scientists alike, to send missionaries to lands not yet mapped by cartographers, but already charted by ambition. A fringe tidbit that historians like to half ignore. In 1614, a Jesuit scholar named Athanasius Kircher attempted to build what he called a catoptric oracle, essentially a mirror machine designed to reflect divine light into written words. It didn't work, at least not the way he hoped, but some claim fragments of his device still sit in a locked glass case at the Collegio Romano. The Jesuits, after all, never saw a boundary between faith and science. They simply called both different dialects of creation. And so the order built observatories, studied medicine, and wrote dictionaries of indigenous languages while preaching salvation. To the outside world, they were monks with telescopes. To their enemies, they were magicians in cassocks. You stop at a cafe along the Via dei Gesuiti, order something you can't pronounce but that arrives with the proper amount of foam and regret, and watch the crowd pass. Tourists, nuns, a man selling plastic rosaries that gleam like counterfeit grace. You think about the Jesuits' motto, Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, for the greater glory of God, and how it sounds both humble and imperial at once, like a prayer disguised as a campaign slogan. Loyola's spiritual exercises were meant to strip away distraction, to mold thought into pure will. But in practice, they became something else. A kind of inner architecture that could withstand interrogation, exile, even death. There's a reason Jesuit missionaries survived where others didn't. They could convince you that heaven was a conversation you were already part of. The mainstream historical fact here is simple but staggering. By the late 17th century, the Jesuit network had become so vast that they effectively ran the world's largest educational system. Universities from Manila to Mexico City bore their seal, and their graduates shaped everything from astronomy to economics. Even Voltaire, who mocked nearly everyone, once grudgingly admitted he had been educated by Jesuits and learned from them the art of argumentation. Yet with that influence came suspicion. They were too organized, too intellectual, too loyal to themselves. The monarchs of Europe began to whisper that the Jesuits owed allegiance not to the Pope, but to their own general. A church within the church, a mind within the mind of God. You wander down toward the Church of the Gesù, their mother church, its Baroque facade glimmering under sunlight like marble pretending to be flesh. Inside, the ceiling explodes into color, frescoes of angels, demons, clouds that seem to float in midair. It's less a building than a hallucination made of plaster. Tourists stare upward until their necks ache, not realizing they're standing beneath one of the most calculated illusions in history. Andrea Pozzo painted the dome with a trick of perspective so perfect that heaven itself becomes an optical lie. That's Jesuit theology in paint. Beauty as strategy, awe as argument. Faith, but make it architecture. You breathe in the dust of centuries and realize how deliberate the manipulation is, and how effective. Behind the altar lies a reliquary that supposedly holds fragments of Ignatius's bones, though scholars quietly admit that no one knows which are real and which are decorative replacements. The church keeps track of miracles better than inventory, one Jesuit historian once joked. You smile to yourself because that feels right. A flicker of sunlight catches a golden inscription on the wall. In omnibus amare et servire Domino, to love and serve God in all things. The line hums through you like static. You picture Loyola writing it in his cramped Basque script, half delirious from fasting, believing he was building an army of enlightenment. Yet every army, no matter how divine, casts a shadow. The Jesuits' shadow was their discipline, so absolute that obedience became its own theology. Perinde ac cadaver, Loyola wrote, as if one were a corpse. To obey your superior as though you were dead. Imagine that. Surrender so complete that even thought becomes sacrament. You recall the open scholarly debate about what that obedience really meant. Was it spiritual transcendence, the ego dissolving before divine will, or early psychological conditioning? Some modern theologians argue Loyola anticipated cognitive behavioral therapy by centuries. Others call it sanctified hypnosis. Either way, it worked. The Jesuits could walk into the courts of emperors or the jungles of Brazil with the same calm certainty, convinced that God's will was their compass. You sip your coffee and think how dangerous that kind of certainty can be, how it turns even kindness into strategy. A young priest passes by in the same black cassock worn since the 1500s. He glances at you briefly, eyes dark and unreadable, then disappears into the crowd. For a heartbeat, you wonder if he saw you, or if he saw through you, the way the portraits did last night. Somewhere a clock chimes 11, and the sound bounces between stone walls like an echo of orders being given. You walk to the side chapel where a small painting shows Ignatius kneeling before Christ, his hands outstretched, surrender glowing in his eyes. The paint has cracked, tiny fissures like veins of time running through faith itself. A plaque beneath the painting claims that during restoration, conservators found a layer of pigment beneath the saint's robes depicting a faint crown. They covered it back up for aesthetic unity. Aesthetic unity, what a polite way to hide a metaphor. The Jesuit crown indeed. The air grows warmer, heavy with candle smoke. You sit on a wooden pew that creaks like an old confession. The church is nearly empty now, just you and the faint buzz of the lights. You remember that one of the Jesuits' earliest missions was to Japan, where they learned to argue theology in the syntax of Zen. They called it inculturation, the art of blending in so completely that truth could be smuggled across borders disguised as understanding. It worked for a while, until suspicion turned to persecution, and martyrs burned for their adaptability. Yet even in ashes, the Jesuit habit survived. Maybe that's the secret to all of this. Not holiness, but endurance disguised as grace. Outside, a street musician plays something slow on a violin, notes rising like incense. You lean against the doorframe, watching the sunlight move across the cobblestones in squares of gold. Somewhere beyond those rooftops sits the Pope himself, dressed in white, the visible half of the church's soul. And somewhere in the shadows, perhaps only metaphorically, stands his mirror, the man in black, commanding with silence what others command with scripture. That's the paradox the prophecy whispers about. The black pope and the white pope, two centers of gravity in one faith, orbiting a truth too dense to name. The Jesuit crown is not metal or jewel, but authority, worn invisibly, passed through centuries like a secret handshake with heaven. As evening gathers again, you follow the Tiber's curve toward the setting sun. Rome glows gold and red, as if the city itself were a relic still on fire. You think about Loyola's first vow, the one that began it all. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty. He meant it as devotion, but somewhere along the line, liberty became influence, and influence became prophecy. You wonder if even he would recognize what his order has become. A brotherhood of scientists, priests, spies, and scholars, still moving like quiet thunder beneath the church that both fears and needs them. The bells begin again, softer this time, and you can almost hear the unspoken refrain, ad majorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory indeed. But whose glory and whose God are questions best left for nights like this. When you reach the Piazza Venezia, the lights of the city shimmer like a rosary made of stars. You glance back once more toward the Church of the Gesù, its facade glowing faintly against the darkening sky, and think you see a figure. You step into the Vatican Library the next morning, the kind of place that makes silence feel loud, and for a moment you forget to breathe because the air itself seems curated. The scent of old paper, beeswax, and dust hangs in layers, as if the centuries never really left, just rearranged themselves alphabetically. A guard with the patience of an archangel checks your pass, nods once, and gestures you toward the main reading hall. A cathedral of intellect where time behaves politely and nothing ever truly dies. The floor gleams like wet stone. Overhead, the frescoed ceiling tells its own theology. Gods, angels, mathematicians, all sharing one golden sky, arguing silently in Latin brushstrokes. Somewhere in these shelves, you're told, lies the manuscript, the one so volatile it was filed under a decoy title, Meteorological Anomalies, which is Vatican speak for, "We don't talk about this in public." You follow the faint hum of the air conditioning, that modern concession to preservation, and try not to imagine what would happen if the lights went out right now. The thought amuses you more than it should. The Vatican is the only place on earth where the apocalypse would start with a librarian clearing their throat. You pass rows of books bound in human patience, calfskin, vellum, wood. Some titles have faded into nothing, the letters eaten by time itself. You wonder how many words were written here to prove that God exists, and how many were written because someone feared he didn't. The mainstream historical fact is easy enough. The Vatican Library holds over 80,000 manuscripts, some dating back more than 1,200 years, including the earliest complete Bible in Greek. It was formally established in 1475 by Pope Sixtus IV, though rumors persist that secret archives existed long before that under other names. In the public story, the library was a triumph of preservation, a way to safeguard civilization's mind. But there's another version, whispered between archivists after hours, that it's also a containment unit, a vault for dangerous ideas that might otherwise infect the faithful. Knowledge as both cure and quarantine. Your footsteps sound muffled on the marble. To your left, a narrow staircase spirals downward, unmarked and uninviting. You hesitate, which of course means you're going down. The light dims as you descend, the air thickens, and the temperature drops by a degree or two. Basements are always colder, but this one feels deliberate, as if even heat refuses to linger near heresy. At the bottom, you find a smaller corridor lined with metal doors. Each bears a tiny brass tag etched with Latin codes, letters, and numbers that look like confessions turned into algebra. You spot one labeled MA 47B, Meteorologica Anomala, Shelf 47, Section B. Your pulse ticks faster. For a bedtime story, this is becoming suspiciously like an initiation. Inside the chamber, light slices through dust like divine geometry. A long wooden table dominates the room, and at its center lies a glass case containing a thin leather-bound volume the color of dried blood. You move closer. The script inside isn't uniform. Different hands, different centuries, stitched together by the same obsession. Marginal notes in ink, in soot, in what might even be wine. The first page bears a title that's half erased, De Umbra Pontificis, on the shadow of the Pope. You let the phrase roll off your tongue and immediately regret it. It feels heavier spoken aloud, like you just knocked on the wrong door. The handwriting shifts across pages. One entry, written in neat Renaissance italics, describes a vision recorded by a Jesuit astronomer during the reign of Urban VIII. In the time of 2 suns, a man in black shall hold the keys, while the man in white shall weep. You blink, reread it, feel a tiny shiver crawl down your spine. 2 suns, a poetic metaphor perhaps, or a literal reference to the 1639 solar halo that appeared over Rome, an optical phenomenon historians note actually frightened the clergy for weeks. There's your quirky tidbit. That year, the Pope banned public sermons mentioning the event, calling it a distraction from holy reason. You imagine the sky splitting into rings of fire while priests argued about optics versus apocalypse, human history in summary. You trace another line with your finger. The ink changes color, darkens, as though the page itself has aged unevenly around certain words. It's an unsettling illusion. One passage mentions a third chair, a throne of silence reserved for a pope who would never be crowned. No explanation follows. The entry ends abruptly with a single symbol, a cross drawn backward. Your reflection in the glass merges with it for a moment, and you can't tell if that's irony or foreshadowing. A sound interrupts you. soft leather soles on stone. You turn, but no one's there. The air tastes faintly metallic, like the moment before thunder. You wonder if you should leave, which of course means you won't. You flip further into the manuscript. Here, the tone changes. The handwriting becomes frantic, as if written in haste. The prophecy is a circle, it reads, and he who completes it will not see its end. Below it, a marginal note in another hand. This line, erased by order of Cardinal Bellarmine, 1600. You remember that name, Bellarmine, the man who oversaw the trial of Galileo. The same one who once wrote, "Theology is the queen of sciences, and all others her servants." You can almost picture him reading this same page, quill hovering, deciding which words deserve to live. The fluorescent light above you flickers, just once. You laugh quietly, because really, what else can you do? It's cliché, sure, but clichés exist because sometimes they're true. You take out your notebook, jot a few phrases, and then pause when you notice a thin seam along the edge of the table. It's not part of the design. You run your thumb along it and feel the faint click of a mechanism. A hidden drawer slides open, exhaling a century of dust. Inside lies a single sheet of paper folded in thirds, brittle and almost translucent. The ink is brown with age, but the Latin is clear enough. Nigro papae nomen est servare lucem. The Black Pope's name is to preserve the light. You sit back, the irony settling in. All this time, the Church's supposed dark prophecy might not be about destruction at all, but protection, a paradox wrapped in metaphor. Maybe the Black Pope isn't an adversary but a guardian, the shadow necessary for light to exist. That's the scholar's open debate in miniature. Is darkness the enemy of divinity or its condition? One theologian called it the chiaroscuro of salvation, which sounds poetic until you realize he probably meant it literally. You close the drawer gently, as if not to wake it. Somewhere above, a clock chimes noon, muffled by layers of stone. The sound travels down like time itself, sighing. You stand, stretch your neck, and catch sight of a security camera in the corner. Small, red light blinking. For a heartbeat, you wonder who's watching and whether they just saw you read something you weren't supposed to. Then the light goes dark. You tell yourself it's just a power fluctuation. You also tell yourself you believe that. You leave the chamber and climb the stairs back into daylight. The sudden brightness feels rude, almost aggressive, like truth after confession. You squint as you step into the courtyard, where tourists are already taking selfies under frescoes that were once considered too sacred to gaze upon. The Vatican is very good at letting mystery coexist with commerce. Divinity, it turns out, photographs well. You buy a bottle of water from a kiosk, drink half in one swallow, and look back at the great dome rising above you. Somewhere under that dome sits the library you just walked out of, and below that, who knows what else. You think about that folded page, the neat Latin, the promise of preserving the light. If that's true, then maybe the prophecy was never about apocalypse, but illumination. Maybe the end of the world is just another name for understanding it too clearly. You cross St. Peter's Square again as clouds gather slow and gray. The obelisk casts a longer shadow now, stretching toward the basilica like a sundial with secrets. A wind picks up, rustling through your clothes, carrying the faint smell of rain and something older, parchment perhaps, or incense burned too long. The first drops fall just as you reach the colonnade, tapping the marble like typewriter keys. You glance once more over your shoulder, half expecting to see a figure in black watching from a balcony. But the windows stare blankly back. The prophecy may sleep, but the library remembers. And if books have souls, this one is definitely still awake. You wake to the steady sound of rain on the Vatican's cobblestones, that slow, percussive rhythm that makes the whole city feel like it's praying under its breath. The air is cleaner now, washed of yesterday's dust, though the marble glistens like wet bone. You make your way toward the apostolic palace, the administrative heart of everything sacred, and yet you can't help but notice that it looks more like a fortress than a home. High walls, guarded gates, an architecture of defense dressed as devotion. It's here, they say, that the two most powerful men of the Church, one in white, one in black, walk the same corridors but never the same path. You think of them like twin planets caught in orbit, close enough to influence, too far to collide. That's the tension the prophecy thrives on, the one that says the Church can never survive its own reflection. Inside, the palace air is dense with polish and protocol. Everything gleams just enough to remind you you're being watched, even when no one's in sight. A Swiss guard passes you, his halberd gleaming, his armor striped like an apologetic carnival. You catch a glimpse of a Jesuit priest in black robes turning a corner, head bowed, pace measured, and you swear for an instant the guard steps aside as if out of instinct. Old habits die harder than faith. The Vatican insists there's no rivalry between the papacy and the Jesuit general. Officially, they serve the same master. Unofficially, everyone in these halls knows better. The man in white rules the Church. The man in black rules the conscience of those who build it. You pause before a fresco depicting the Council of Trent. Bishops locked in debate, a sea of red robes arguing over salvation while one Jesuit stands to the side, face half in shadow. You can't tell if the painter did that on purpose or if the centuries dimmed him out of politeness. The mainstream historical fact, the Council of Trent, held between 1545 and 1563, was where the Church declared war on the Reformation and reinvented itself. Jesuits became the Church's new special forces, teachers, confessors, infiltrators, and, when required, martyrs. But the same council also established the doctrine of papal supremacy, ensuring that no one could challenge Rome's throne. It's strange, you think, how the council birthed both obedience and disobedience in the same breath. The white throne was polished brighter. The black robe was sharpened darker. A soft echo leads you toward a small chapel adjoining the papal apartments. You step inside quietly. It's dim, fragrant with incense, a sanctuary for solitude that somehow feels too aware of its own importance. A single candle burns near the altar, its light barely touching the edges of a wooden confessional. You sit, not to confess, but to listen. The walls here know more secrets than any diary. You imagine the popes who prayed in this room, some saints, some politicians, a few likely both, and wonder if they ever whispered the same prayer as Loyola did. Teach me to serve as you deserve. What happens, you think, when God gives two men the same prayer and only one answer? A fringe tidbit comes to mind, one that scholars mention cautiously, almost like gossip. During the 17th century, Jesuit General Muzio Vitelleschi was rumored to have kept a key to a hidden passage connecting his residence to the papal quarters. There's no proof, of course, just the tantalizing claim in an old diary discovered in the Jesuit archives. Its author, an unnamed secretary, wrote of conversations that begin after midnight and end before confession. You picture the scene, one man in white, one in black, candles flickering between them, debating whether prophecy is divine or dangerous. Maybe that's how most of history is written, not by decree, but by whispers after curfew. You tilt your head back, staring at the fresco on the chapel ceiling. Angels tumble through clouds, clutching scrolls that declare veritas vincit, truth triumphs. You can't help but grin. If truth really triumphed, this building would be half empty. Somewhere behind these frescoed walls sits the Jesuit Curia, the general's headquarters, a short walk, yet a world away. The two men never meet without ceremony, their correspondence wrapped in courtesies sharp enough to draw blood. You once read that during the reign of Pope Clement XIV, who suppressed the Jesuits in 1773, his health deteriorated so rapidly that superstitious Rome whispered he'd been cursed by the order he exiled. The rumor claimed that the Jesuit general sent him a small black box containing a single parchment inscribed with the Latin words, Habeas humilitatem tuam. May you keep your humility. Within months, Clement was dead. Historians call it coincidence. Rome calls it karma with a liturgical vocabulary. You leave the chapel and wander through the palace's quieter halls, where portraits of popes line the walls like a gallery of men trying very hard to look eternal. Some gaze outward, serene and untouchable. Others seem caught mid-thought, as if they can still hear their successors arguing centuries later. Near the end of one corridor, you find a smaller portrait half hidden behind a velvet curtain. You pull it aside gently. The painting shows a Jesuit in black robes, his hand resting on a book, his expression unreadable. No plaque, no name. Yet someone cared enough to keep it out of sight. The signature in the corner is faded, but you can just make out a Latin phrase painted beneath. Duae manus, una fides, 2 hands, 1 faith. You walk on, the phrase looping in your mind. 2 hands, 1 faith. The white throne and the black robe. It sounds less like rivalry and more like choreography. The Church needs both, the pageantry of purity and the machinery of control. The robe cleanses in shadow, the throne commands in light. But the prophecy, if true, threatens to merge them, to make one man both light and dark, a unity too dangerous to sustain. The open scholarly debate among theologians centers on this very tension. Is the Black Pope simply a symbol of conscience or a prediction of the final convergence of authority? The day when faith and reason, obedience and rebellion unite in one figure. Some scholars say that moment would signify spiritual perfection. Others say it would end the Church as we know it. Everyone agrees it would make a terrible press release. Outside, thunder rolls across the city like a sermon with bad timing. You step to the window. Rain drips from the ledge, blurring the dome of St. Peter's in the distance. You watch a group of priests hurry across the courtyard below, black robes flaring behind them like ink spilling across parchment. In the far corner, a white cassock moves slower, deliberate, umbrella held like a halo. For a heartbeat, the scene looks choreographed, black and white moving in rhythm, neither dominating, both necessary. You wonder if the prophecy is less prediction than pattern, repeating through time. When one grows too powerful, the other rises to balance it. You remember something from last night's reading in the library? The prophecy is a circle, and he who completes it will not see its end. What if that's not a warning but a rule? The Church survives because it never lets the circle close. The Pope reigns in white daylight. The Jesuit general works in twilight. Between them lies dawn, a liminal hour the Vatican prefers to skip. You press your forehead against the cool glass and think of how every empire eventually builds its own opposition inside its walls. The robe and the throne are simply 2 halves of one body, arguing over who gets to breathe first. A sudden flash of lightning turns the window into a mirror. For an instant, your reflection merges with the dome's silhouette, and you look like a ghost wearing Rome as a mask. You laugh quietly. 2 hands, 1 faith, you whisper. Maybe it applies to you now too. The rain eases, the thunder moves on, and the silence that follows feels intentional, like the pause before a revelation that decides not to arrive. You turn away from the window, footsteps soft against centuries of polished intrigue. Somewhere down the hall, a door closes gently, too gently to be random. You stop, listen. Nothing. But when you glance back at the painting with the hidden Jesuit, the velvet curtain has fallen shut again. As you exit into the courtyard, the rain has stopped entirely. The cobblestones gleam under a pale sky, and the scent of petrichor mixes with incense from an unseen chapel. You breathe deeply, almost reverently, though you're not sure which part you're revering, the faith or the architecture of secrecy that holds it together. The bells begin to ring. Not the grand tolls from last night, but softer ones, like a memory reminding you that time here is circular too. The white throne gleams above. The black robe moves below. Somewhere between them, the prophecy stirs, restless as ever, waiting for the day when the rain has stopped, but the sky above Rome still carries that bruised pewter light that makes even angels on the rooftops look uneasy. You move through the narrow streets toward the Vatican archives again, drawn not by curiosity this time, but by inevitability, like a moth retracing the flame that already burned it. Today's destination isn't the hidden chamber or the whispers of Jesuits. It's a piece of parchment from the 12th century that has outlived kings, empires, and common sense. It's called The Prophecy of the Popes, attributed to an Irish archbishop named Saint Malachy, who supposedly saw every pope that would ever sit on the throne of Saint Peter. The Vatican's official line is that it's of doubtful authenticity, which, as Vatican denials go, might as well be a confession written in Latin. You find yourself in a smaller, colder room than the Grand Library, one lined not with gold and frescoes, but with steel cabinets and a humidity control system that hums like a nervous prayer. A curator with tired eyes hands you a facsimile wrapped in tissue paper. The real one, she says, hasn't seen sunlight since Mussolini was still shaking hands in these halls. You unfold the copy carefully. The parchment is filled with short Latin phrases, each supposedly describing a pope. The first few are obvious. Ex castro Tiberis, from the Tiber's castle. De labore solis, from the labor of the sun. And at the very end, one chilling line. In persecution extrema SRE, sedibit Petrus Romanus. In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, Peter the Roman shall reign. After him, the city of 7 hills shall be destroyed, and the dreadful judge shall judge his people. That's the mainstream historical fact, at least the part anyone dares to print. Malachy's prophecy appeared publicly around 1595, conveniently during a papal election, when prophecies had excellent marketing potential. It lists 112 popes from his own day to the world's end, and depending on how you count, we're currently hovering suspiciously near the finish line. Every new pope since has been matched, often retroactively, to one of the phrases. Some fits are poetic, others are forced enough to make even medieval theologians roll their eyes. Yet the coincidences keep piling up. One predicted the lily and the rose for a pope born in Florence whose family crest bore both. Another from the half moon for a pope elected between 2 lunar eclipses. Even modern popes can't escape the pattern. The Jesuit Pope Francis, our current one, corresponds eerily with the phrase before the final line, De gloria olivae, of the glory of the olive. Olives mean peace. Francis is the first pope from the order known for vows of peace and poverty. The match feels too neat, too cinematic, the kind of thing conspiracy theorists write screenplays about when they're supposed to be sleeping. You trace your finger along the final line again, Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman. Scholars have been arguing about that name for centuries. Is it literal, a pope who will take Peter's name and oversee the church's destruction, or symbolic, a return to the church's origins, to humility, to the fisherman in the dirt before empire crowned him? The open scholarly debate divides neatly along the usual lines. Historians call it forgery, theologians call it mystery, and poets call it destiny. The Vatican, for its part, calls it a distraction. And yet, copies of the prophecy remain in private Jesuit collections, annotated by anonymous hands. One marginal note reads, "When the olive is broken, the black seed shall rise." You're not sure if that's horticulture or apocalypse, but either way, it doesn't sound like good news for olives. A memory surfaces from your earlier wanderings, those paintings of black-robed men standing just outside the edge of history, like understudies waiting for the lead actor to forget his lines. The Black Pope, the Jesuit general, is never directly mentioned in Malachy's list, but the timing lines up too neatly to ignore. The first Jesuit pope in history coinciding with the prophecy's final verses feels less like coincidence and more like a plot twist written by divine irony. You think of that phrase from the hidden manuscript, "The Black Pope's name is to preserve the light." What if that's the key? What if the Black Pope isn't the destroyer but the keeper, the shadow cast by illumination? You smile faintly at the absurdity of it all and then realize that absurdity has always been religion's favorite disguise. The curator returns briefly, reminding you that your viewing time is almost over. You nod, but she lingers, glancing at the parchment as if it might move on its own. "It's only paper," she says softly, almost to herself. You hear something in her tone that isn't quite belief but isn't disbelief either. Just the fatigue of someone who's watched too many prophecies outlive their debunking. When she leaves, you stay another moment, tracing the faded ink. The parchment trembles slightly under your breath, and for a fleeting second you imagine the ghost of Saint Malachi smirking somewhere over your shoulder, whispering, "I told you so." Outside, the day has turned strange. The sun fights behind a veil of thin clouds, making the world look half-lit, like a stage between acts. You wander into St. Peter's Basilica again, drawn to the great bronze canopy that towers over the altar. Bernini built it like a crown of movement, columns twisting like muscles, angels caught mid-flight, everything striving upward, yet rooted in weight. You stand beneath it, looking up, and realize that the canopy itself mirrors the structure of the church, beauty suspended by tension. The bronze, historians note, was melted down from the Pantheon's ancient beams, pagan metal reforged into Christian glory. That's another mainstream fact, the Vatican's recycling program for empires. But you can't help thinking how symbolic it is, the old gods still holding up the new. You walk toward the tomb of St. Peter, the supposed resting place of the first pope, buried beneath layers of marble and centuries of renovation. Pilgrims kneel nearby, some weeping, some scrolling on their phones, faith and Wi-Fi in perfect coexistence. You kneel too, not to pray exactly, but to listen. The air down here hums, faint but real, like the vibration of a heartbeat through stone. You wonder how many of the popes on Malachi's list have stood over this same grave, wondering if they were the last one. You think about Pope Benedict's quiet resignation, the first in 6 centuries, and Pope Francis's weary insistence that the Church must learn to breathe again. Breathing, yes, but the air feels thinner with each prophecy fulfilled. Then a fringe tidbit floats to mind, one that sounds more like folklore than footnote. In 1958, during the conclave that elected John the 23rd, white smoke appeared from the Sistine Chapel's chimney before the cardinals had voted. The crowd erupted, believing a pope had been chosen, but minutes later, the smoke turned black again. Vatican radio claimed it was a chemical mishap, yet some in Rome whispered that the prophecy had tried to fulfill itself too soon. Peter was impatient, they said. You don't believe it, not really, but you also don't not believe it. That's the danger of Rome. Even skepticism sounds religious here. A priest passes behind you, his footsteps soft as ash. He pauses near the altar, lights a candle, and glances in your direction. Prophecies, he says quietly, as though reading your thoughts, are not about what will happen. They are about what must be remembered. Then he walks away, leaving the flame dancing in the draft. You watch the candle flicker, its small light swallowed and reborn by shadow. The phrase from the manuscript echoes again in your mind, to preserve the light. Maybe this is what that meant, not to save the world, but to save the idea of it. The bells begin to ring outside, long and low, their sound threading through the corridors like an old conversation. You step out into the square as twilight settles in. The obelisk in the center catches the last light, its shadow stretching toward the basilica doors. You remember reading once that the obelisk originally stood in Nero's circus, where early Christians were executed, and that Peter himself may have died within its reach. That's your historical fact for the evening. The church built its holiest site on the bones of its first victims. Transformation through geography, a recurring Roman theme. As darkness gathers, you sit on the edge of the fountain, the water rippling under the faint hum of electricity from hidden lights. The tourists are gone now. The square is nearly empty except for the occasional echo of a shoe against marble. The Vatican at night is quieter than any church, an empire asleep but dreaming audibly. You think of Malachi again, the bishop from the damp hills of Ireland who saw too far ahead. Maybe he didn't predict the end at all. Maybe he just understood that faith, like prophecy, feeds on tension, the need to believe balanced against the fear of being right. You tilt your head back, letting the mist from the fountain touch your face, and imagine the voice of the Irish prophet drifting through centuries. Not a curse, not even a warning. Just a reminder that nothing built on belief ever truly ends. Somewhere high above, a window in the apostolic palace glows faintly. You can't tell whose room it is, but for a moment, you imagine two silhouettes, one in white, one in black, standing close enough to share the same view. Perhaps they're looking down at you now, amused by how seriously you take their prophecy, or perhaps they're simply waiting for the next name to be written in a list that has long since run out of space. Either way, the story continues, and you, the listener, are now part of it. One more pilgrim under the gray Roman sky, caught between history and myth, light and shadow, truth and its mirror. The bells fade, the square stills, and for the first time all evening, the air feels perfectly still, like the world holding its breath before turning another page. Rome never truly sleeps. It only changes its lighting. Tonight, the city glows gold at the edges, the air thick with moisture, the stones warm from the day's memory. You walk along the Tiber, its surface reflecting broken halos from street lamps, until the road curves toward the Borgo Santo Spirito, home of the Jesuit Curia, the beating heart of the Society of Jesus. It's a building that manages to look both invisible and inevitable, its facade simple, almost apologetic, as if pretending not to hold the blueprint for half the world's conscience. Yet beneath that quiet exterior, you know there are corridors that hum with the weight of centuries, decisions whispered into being long before anyone in white signs them. This is where the Black Pope lives, not a rival pontiff, not exactly, but the mirror the Vatican keeps in a locked room. Inside, the air is cool and still. Jesuits move through the halls with the calm efficiency of men who have already forgiven themselves for existing. Their black cassocks ripple faintly like the surface of water disturbed by thought. You nod to one who passes by, but he doesn't return the gesture. Not out of arrogance, just habit. Jesuits are trained to notice without reacting, to observe without belonging. It's how they survived every exile and suppression. You remember that during the 18th century, nearly every Catholic monarch in Europe expelled them, accusing them of manipulation, espionage, even witchcraft. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV dissolved the order entirely under political pressure, a historical fact recorded in every theology textbook worth its ink. And yet, in 1814, they returned as if nothing had happened. No rebellion, no bloodshed, just a quiet reappearance, as though the shadow had simply stepped aside for a generation and then resumed its shape. The archivist leading your tour stops before a heavy oak door and gestures for silence. You step into a small chamber lined with books bound in identical black leather, the titles stamped in gold Latin you can barely read. The scent of old paper and candle smoke lingers here too, though you can tell the candles are long gone. Modern light fixtures hum softly in their place. The archivist, a thin man with sharp spectacles, explains that this room holds records of the general congregations, the gatherings that elect a new superior general whenever the old one dies. Jesuits call it their own conclave, though unlike the Vatican's, there are no white smokes or cheering crowds. Our process is quieter, he says with a faint smile, and usually more permanent. You ask how long a superior general serves. He tilts his head slightly, until God decides otherwise, which given their average lifespan sounds more like a contract than a calling. You imagine the scene. Dozens of black-robed priests locked away for days, fasting, praying, their decision made not by ambition, but by obedience, at least officially. A fringe tidbit comes to mind, something you once read in a footnote most scholars skip. In 1829, a Jesuit chronicler named Father Rinaldi described a peculiar ritual allegedly performed during the election. Before casting their votes, each man would whisper a vow, non propter honorum, sed propter crucem, not for honor, but for the cross. Yet Rinaldi added, perhaps unintentionally, that the vow was made in tenebris, in the dark. No light, no witnesses, only faith and shadow negotiating leadership. No one has ever confirmed that detail, but the imagery is too perfect to ignore. You wonder if Loyola would have approved, or if he'd have called it theater disguised as virtue. You take a seat at a long wooden table while the archivist retrieves a folder. Every Jesuit general leaves behind letters, spiritual guidance, personal reflections, sometimes warnings, he explains. He places a thin file before you. This one is from Pedro Arupe, 29th Superior General, written in 1981. You recognize the name. Arupe led the order through the chaos of the Cold War, the liberation theology debates, and the aftermath of Vatican II. The letter, handwritten in graceful Spanish, begins gently enough. El futuro de la compañía será su fidelidad a la cruz invisible. The future of the society will be its fidelity to the invisible cross. You scan further down. A later line catches your eye. Si llega el día en que el Papa y el General hablen con una sola voz, el mundo habrá alcanzado su juicio. If the day comes when the Pope and the General speak with one voice, the world will have reached its judgment. You sit back, the words ringing faintly. It's not prophecy exactly, but it echoes the tension that's haunted the Church for centuries. The idea that these two offices, both sworn to God, must never fully align, or something cosmic will give way. You ask the archivist if Arupe's letter is widely known. He shakes his head. It was meant for his successor only, he says, and closes the file with deliberate care. Most of what you'll read here, he adds, was written for obedience, not curiosity. You can't tell if that's a warning or an invitation. Outside, thunder mutters again in the distance, the Roman sky repeating last night's performance. The archivist excuses himself, leaving you alone among the shelves. You wander, fingertips brushing the spines of anonymous volumes. A few are tagged with numerical codes rather than titles. One catches your attention, 13.13, Silentium Cordis, the silence of the heart. You slide it out carefully, expecting another manual of spiritual exercises. Instead, it's a transcript of a closed session from a Jesuit congregation held in 1640. The Latin is dense, but one phrase stands out. Nomen nigri papae, non est malum sed memoria. The name of the Black Pope is not evil, but remembrance. You feel a chill. Memory, not menace. If that's true, then all the fear surrounding the title might be deliberate misdirection, a kind of theological smokescreen. You flip to the back and find a page marked by a faint oil stain in the shape of a handprint. Beneath it, a scribbled note in Italian, Quando la luce non può parlare, l'ombra prega per lei. When the light cannot speak, the shadow prays for it. You close the book slowly, half expecting the room to react. But the only sound is the low, constant hum of electricity, pretending to be silence. When you step back into the corridor, you notice a Jesuit walking ahead of you, a tall figure moving with steady purpose. You follow, more out of instinct than decision. The man turns down a stairwell, deeper into the building. You hesitate only briefly before descending after him. The steps spiral tighter, and the air grows warmer, heavier. At the bottom, the corridor opens into what looks like a chapel stripped of ornament. Bare walls, plain altar, no crucifix. Just a simple wooden table with 7 chairs arranged in a circle. The man in black stands at the far end, hands clasped. You're not supposed to be here, he says calmly, not turning around. His voice is gentle but carries authority that doesn't need to raise itself. You apologize automatically, but he shakes his head. Curiosity is part of faith, he says, finally facing you. His face is older than his posture suggests, lined but alive, eyes the color of polished stone. You're here because you're meant to see. He gestures toward the table. This is where we gather when one of us is called home. We speak the names of the dead, not to mourn, but to remind the living what obedience costs. He looks at the empty chairs. Each seat belongs to a man who carried a secret he couldn't die with. We call it the Circle of the Crossed Keys. You glance around, uncertain whether to ask questions or flee. He continues as though reading your thoughts. The prophecy you've been following, it's older than Malachi, older than Rome. It's not about popes or endings. It's about what happens when knowledge forgets humility. He moves closer, the soft fabric of his robe barely whispering. The Black Pope, he says, isn't a person. It's a role, a safeguard. Every age needs one. You start to speak, but he raises a hand. You'll understand later. Or you won't. Both are acceptable outcomes. Before you can respond, a faint chime sounds somewhere overhead. 3 slow bells. The Jesuit tilts his head slightly, listening. Vespers, he murmurs. You should go. He steps past you toward the stairs, and when you turn to follow, he's already gone. You climb back to the main floor, the sound of the bells fading behind you. Part of you wonders if you imagined it, if fatigue has begun rearranging the border between belief and dream. Rome has that effect. It makes hallucination feel like history. You step outside into the courtyard just as rain begins again, softer this time, almost musical. The lamps reflect off the puddles, turning the stones into sheets of liquid gold. You think of the 7 chairs, the circle, the priest's voice saying every age needs one. Maybe that's why the Jesuits endure, because every empire needs its conscience, and every conscience needs somewhere to hide. The thunder grumbles once more, then retreats across the sky like a reluctant judge. You look back at the curious dark windows. No movement, no light. Just that quiet, watchful stillness that has outlasted every century's attempt to name it. You walk along the wet cobblestones toward the river again. The Tiber glows faintly under the lamps, its surface smooth as black glass. You catch your reflection in it, blurry, uncertain, and think of all the reflections Rome hides, of faith in politics, of shadow in holiness, of prophecy in bureaucracy. Somewhere behind you, the bells stop, and the world exhales. The Jesuit conclave may never make headlines, but tonight you've seen its ghost, and you can't unsee it. You feel the city breathing through its own history, and you realize that the prophecy, whatever it truly means, isn't waiting for apocalypse. It's waiting for understanding. And understanding, as the Jesuits know better than anyone, is the most dangerous miracle of all. You wake before dawn when Rome is still suspended between sleep and confession. The air smells of damp stone and something faintly metallic, like incense clinging to iron. The bells haven't yet begun their daily sermon, and the silence feels unearned, like a secret you've stumbled into rather than inherited. You step out onto the street, following instinct more than direction, and find yourself near the Vatican Observatory's old entrance at Castel Gandolfo, the papal retreat south of the city where faith used to gaze through telescopes and hope it wouldn't flinch. The guards are gone now. The Vatican sold the building decades ago, moving its instruments to Arizona. But back in the 17th century, this was where the Church tried to reconcile astronomy and theology, the stars and the Psalms, light and dogma. You can almost imagine the long-robed scholars standing under candlelight, muttering prayers before pointing their lenses toward creation, afraid that what they'd find might contradict Genesis, or worse, confirm it. You came here chasing the trail of one man, Pope Sylvester II, the so-called magician pope. The mainstream historical fact is clear enough. He reigned from the year 999 until 1003, a mathematician, philosopher, and scholar who introduced the decimal system and Arabic numerals to medieval Europe. He's remembered for trying to drag the Church into rationality, for believing that the divine could be measured as much as adored. But the legends are less kind. According to chroniclers, he built mechanical heads that spoke prophecies, studied forbidden geometry, and made pacts with the devil in exchange for knowledge. A few even whispered that he discovered a way to calculate the date of the apocalypse itself, a number so dangerous it was buried with him beneath St. John Lateran. Historians dismiss this as myth, yet the Lateran's custodians still recite a peculiar phrase during restoration rituals. Numerus Dei taceat dum terra dormit. Let the number of God remain silent while the earth sleeps. You tell yourself it's poetic superstition. You also tell yourself you've been saying that a lot lately. You walk the empty courtyard of the former observatory, where vines climb the walls like green prayers trying to reach heaven through neglect. The stars above are faint, washed out by the distant glow of Rome, but you can still trace the outline of Orion. One of Sylvester's writings mentioned the constellation as a divine cipher, each star corresponding to a psalm. You remember reading that passage late last night in a translated manuscript, a quirky tidbit few outside Vatican circles know. The Pope's private notes used prime numbers to reference specific verses, a secret indexing system that scholars have decoded only partially. One notation, 113, pointed to a psalm that reads, "From the rising of the sun unto the going down of the same, the Lord's name is to be praised." Another, 666, had no corresponding verse. The page was simply blank. You step into the crumbling building through an unlocked door. Dust swirls in your flashlight beam, each mote moving like a tiny planet in orbit. The corridor opens into an old study, wooden desk, broken telescope, a few papers left behind from a more bureaucratic era. You brush the dust from one, revealing the Vatican seal and a date, 1951, a letter, unsigned. The Latin is bureaucratic, but one line stands out. Formula Gerberti nondum clausa est. The formula of Gerbert remains unfinished. Gerbert of Aurillac. That was Sylvester II's original name before the papacy renamed him for respectability. A chill runs through you. The idea that 20th century scholars were still referencing a millennium-old equation is absurd, and therefore, in Vatican terms, entirely plausible. You pull out your notebook and start writing the phrase down when you notice another detail. The back of the paper is covered in numbers, scrawled in a different hand. Some are circled, others underlined. They look random until you realize they form coordinates. 41.9029 degrees north, 12.4534 degrees east. You blink. That's St. Peter's Basilica. More precisely, its dome. You feel that strange tug again, the one between curiosity and self-preservation. You already know which side wins. By the time you return to Rome, the city has fully woken. Vendors shout near the river, bells clang like impatient saints, and pigeons strut with the entitlement of cardinals. You stop at a cafe for espresso so strong it could wake the martyrs and study your notes. The pattern is almost elegant. If each number corresponds to a biblical verse, and each verse to a coordinate on the basilica's architecture, then the dome itself might form an encoded diagram. You flip through an old tourist map, marking the coordinates in pencil. The pattern that emerges isn't random, it's a spiral, Fibonacci's spiral, the golden ratio, divine proportion rendered in stone. Michelangelo designed the dome centuries after Sylvester's death, yet you can't shake the feeling that he might have known the pattern already, hidden it there deliberately. A whisper of design passed across generations like a riddle disguised as beauty. You cross the square toward the basilica, dodging umbrellas and tour groups. The closer you get, the more the architecture seems to hum, a low, vibrating energy you can almost feel in your ribs. Inside, the light filtering through the dome feels thicker than usual, gold turning to amber, shadow clinging to the edges. You find the spot near the base of the dome where your coordinates intersect, a marble inlay shaped like a starburst. It's unremarkable to everyone else, but to you, it's a punctuation mark in geometry's hidden sentence. You crouch, ignoring the stairs, and trace the pattern. The marble feels faintly warm, though the air around it is cool. When you look up, your gaze meets a mosaic of Christ holding an open book. The Latin inscription reads, "Tu es Petrus." You are Peter. You almost laugh at the symmetry of it. Prophecy nested inside architecture, numbers disguised as devotion. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you recall an obscure chronicle written by a Benedictine monk in the 11th century. When the Pope shall measure heaven with the tools of earth, the Church will speak in equations. Scholars dismiss it as allegory, but here you are, tracing the line between prophecy and algebra. You wonder if Sylvester would have smiled at that or wept. You remember his famous quote, recorded by his students, "Mathematica est lingua Dei si Deus vult audiri." Mathematics is the language of God. if God wishes to be heard. The open scholarly debate still echoes today. Was Sylvester II a rationalist ahead of his time, or a heretic who tried to quantify divinity? Historians call him the scientist who became a saint, but folklore insists he died screaming that numbers were bleeding from his eyes. You prefer to think he simply realized what all mathematicians eventually do, that the universe doesn't explain itself. It just keeps the conversation interesting. You stay beneath the dome longer than planned, watching the shifting light crawl up the columns. You notice how the shadows move slower here, as if the architecture resists time. The hum of tourists fades, replaced by the soft shuffle of a priest passing behind you. He pauses, perhaps recognizing the intent on your face. "It's a perfect circle," he says, nodding toward the dome. "Michelangelo said he built it to remind us that God never draws a straight line." You nod politely, but his words linger. Straight lines are human inventions, borders, rules, hierarchies. Circles belong to the divine, endless, recurring, impossible to own. The prophecy of Malachi, the balance of the black and white popes, even Sylvester's formula, they all seem to orbit the same center. A circle that refuses to close because closure means ending, and the Church's greatest trick has always been pretending eternity is just good branding. As dusk returns, you find yourself walking toward the Tiber again. The water reflects the first stars, each ripple distorting constellations into unreadable symbols. You remember that Sylvester believed the heavens were a code book, not a decoration. He once wrote, "Every star is a number, and every number is a name of God." You imagine him under this same sky 1,000 years ago, scratching calculations into parchment, trying to translate light into theology. Maybe that's what drove him mad. Or maybe it was the realization that math and faith both demand the same thing, belief without proof. You stop at the Ponte Sant'Angelo, the Bridge of Angels, where Bernini's marble sentinels watch over the river. Their faces are too human, pained, questioning, as if they've overheard a divine argument they weren't meant to witness. You lean against the railing, feeling the vibration of traffic through the stone. Somewhere behind you, a church bell tolls once, slow and deliberate. You check your watch, midnight. You realize you've been awake for 20 hours, yet your mind hums with the rhythm of equations that refuse to rest. A gust of wind ripples the water, distorting the reflection of the dome into spirals. For a heartbeat, the pattern looks exactly like the Fibonacci curve from your notes, mirrored perfectly in the river. You blink, and it's gone. Just coincidence, you tell yourself. But coincidence is what prophecy calls itself when it wants to stay employed. You remember the archivist's words. When the Pope and the General speak with one voice, the world will have reached its judgment. You wonder if that voice will speak in numbers. A fringe rumor drifts through your memory, one that modern Jesuits laugh off but never deny outright. It claims that deep within the Vatican Observatory archives lies a device built on Sylvester's unfinished formula. Not a telescope, not exactly, but a kind of harmonic engine that converts celestial coordinates into sound. A literal voice of God. It's said that every few decades, when a Jesuit astronomer grows too curious, the machine is reassembled, only to be dismantled again after producing a single unrecordable tone. You try to picture it. A chord so perfect it drives men to prayer or madness, a sound that confirms both creation and ending. The rumor adds that one pope, fascinated and terrified, ordered the machine sealed in a vault under Castel Gandolfo with the warning, "Let silence guard what truth cannot bear." You stare at the water, at your own reflection dissolving in motion. Perhaps Sylvester's formula was never about prediction or apocalypse. Perhaps it was about equilibrium, the numbers required to keep chaos at bay. The Church, for all its history of control, has always been most afraid of balance. You think again of the prophecy's last line, "Peter the Roman shall reign," and wonder if it's less about a person than a concept, a return to origin, to unity, to math's version of God. A sudden noise breaks your thoughts, a clatter of footsteps on the bridge behind you. You turn, half expecting a tourist, but the street is empty. Only the nearest angel watches you, face tilted toward the sky. You sigh, chalk it up to nerves, and begin walking back toward your lodging. As you pass the statue, you notice something carved faintly at its base, nearly erased by time. A sequence of digits. Not random, not vandalism. Deliberate. You jot them down. 3.141592. The beginning of pi. The infinite number, the circle again. You laugh softly, though it comes out more like surrender. Rome is trolling you, and it's winning. By the time you reach your room, dawn's first gray streaks are bleeding through the blinds. You collapse into the chair by the window, watching the city stretch awake. Church bells begin again, their overlapping tones forming imperfect harmonies, mathematical yet emotional. For a moment, the sound almost resembles a pattern, a code you can almost decipher, but not quite. You think of Sylvester again, dying 1,000 years ago, whispering numbers to an audience of angels who probably took notes. Maybe he didn't predict the end of the church. Maybe he just calculated its rhythm, the precise frequency that keeps faith oscillating between reason and mystery. As the sun climbs, you close your notebook and finally exhale. You realize that the Vatican doesn't hide secrets because they're dangerous. It hides them because they're unfinished. Equations, prophecies, opposites in orbit, forever solving and unsolving themselves. You let your eyes drift shut, and the city hums in its familiar key. A soft, mathematical prayer, looping endlessly, promising nothing, proving everything. Dawn breaks sharp and silver over the rooftops of Rome, and for once, you don't wake to bells, but to birds, the kind that sound too ancient to belong in a city this modern. Their calls echo off the stone facades, thin and metallic, as if the air itself remembers something you've forgotten. Today, the streets smell faintly of rain and espresso and something else. Ozone, maybe, or the ghost of lightning. You follow the scent to the open square outside the Vatican museums, where the early sun has turned the cobblestones into molten gold. Somewhere above that gold sky, a comet once burned so bright that the world thought it was the finger of God. The mainstream historical fact is this. On February 25th, 1577, a comet streaked across Europe for 70 nights. It was visible even in daylight. The Church called it a celestial sermon. The Jesuits called it data. Tycho Brahe measured its parallax and proved it was farther than the moon, shattering Aristotle's ancient notion that the heavens were perfect and unchanging. That discovery cracked theology like glass. Suddenly, the heavens moved. Perfection wasn't permanent. The Vatican, predictably, called for a meeting. They gathered theologians, astronomers, and one particularly ambitious Jesuit named Christoph Clavius, who would later help reform the Gregorian calendar. He insisted the comet was a natural event, no divine omen, no apocalypse. But outside these marble walls, Rome panicked. Priests led processions through the streets, waving relics at the sky. Mothers dipped their babies' feet in holy water. Even cardinals carried umbrellas indoors, as though grace might leak. You walk toward the Vatican's old observatory tower, the Torre dei Venti, the Tower of the Winds. Few tourists visit. It's tucked behind administrative buildings, more ghost than monument. Inside, the air smells of dust and limestone, the scent of old instruments dreaming of relevance. A narrow spiral staircase climbs into the dimness above, and you follow it until the light spills from a circular room lined with faded frescoes. Angels blow wind across painted seas, their faces weathered, their halos cracked. In the center of the room, a brass meridian line splits the marble floor, running north to south. It's both scientific instrument and holy metaphor, a mark where sunlight decides what's true. Clavius used this tower to measure the equinox, to prove time itself was a negotiable contract between man and heaven. You stand where he once stood, letting the morning light cut across your shoes. There's something deeply human about this, the attempt to make eternity measurable. You think about how faith keeps trying to domesticate infinity, and how the cosmos keeps politely declining. On the far wall, a painted diagram of the 1577 comet curves like a scar across the sky. Someone added it later, an unknown hand, perhaps centuries ago. Beneath it, a line in Latin, Ignis ambulans ante thronum Dei, fire walking before the throne of God. You reach out, tracing the faded ink, and your fingers come away dusty but trembling. There's a story you half remember, one of those fringe tidbits historians mention only to disclaim. In 1623, a young Jesuit mathematician claimed to have found a pattern connecting every major comet to a papal succession. Each celestial visitation, he argued, marked a shift in divine authority, a cosmic timestamp for the Church's chapters. His work, De Caelo Mutabili, was never published. The Vatican quietly confiscated the manuscript, and the author was reassigned to a mission in Paraguay, where he conveniently died of a fever. Yet, in an old Jesuit letter, one you saw quoted in a footnote buried in some scholar's appendix, the general of the order allegedly wrote, "He calculated too far into heaven and found himself counted among the missing." You can't decide whether that's poetry or policy. The light shifts as clouds drift across the sky. The meridian line darkens, swallowing the sun's reflection. For a moment, you feel like you're standing at the intersection of science and superstition, where every discovery is just another heresy waiting for better timing. You remember how Galileo once presented his telescope to the Jesuits of the Collegio Romano, expecting support, and received polite silence instead. They confirmed his findings, the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, but refused to endorse them publicly. One Jesuit wrote in his diary, "Truth requires temperance. Even the stars can wait." The Vatican has been waiting ever since. You turn toward a small alcove in the corner of the room. Inside sits an old brass instrument, a sextant or something like it, half polished, half corroded. A small plaque beneath it reads simply, Clavius, 1582. You kneel to look closer and notice faint scratches along the rim, numbers, coordinates, and one Latin phrase etched with a shaking hand. Cauda lucis iterat. The tale of light returns. The handwriting is unmistakably old, yet oddly familiar. You remember the same phrase scribbled in one of the Jesuit manuscripts from Section 3, buried in the De Umbra Pontificis. The prophecy of the Black Pope again, resurfacing where it doesn't belong. You whisper the words aloud, and your voice feels too loud in the small room. The tale of light returns. Maybe it's coincidence, or maybe someone, centuries ago, wove the comet into the prophecy, connecting the Church's fate not to Scripture, but to astronomy. A theological meteorology, you imagine it. Every papal era aligned with a comet's return, a cosmic balancing act of sin and redemption written across the sky. The thought makes your pulse quicken. You step to the window and look up, half expecting a streak of fire to cut the heavens. Nothing. Just a pale Roman morning, stubbornly ordinary. You descend the spiral stairs back into the courtyard, where the air feels heavier now, thick with sunlight and static. The city hums faintly around you, the sound of scooters, vendors, life resuming its distracted rhythm. Yet the idea won't leave you. You stop at a bench beneath an olive tree, open your notebook, and start sketching the timeline of popes and comets. 1577, Gregory XIII, the Reformer. 1680, Innocent XI, who fought corruption. 1811, Pius VII, exiled by Napoleon. 1910, Pius VI, mourning modernism. 2013, Francis, the Jesuit. The pattern almost fits. Almost. You trace it again, noticing that each comet seems to appear during a period of transformation or crisis. Reform, exile, contradiction. You underline the dates. The tale of light returns, you murmur. Maybe the prophecy isn't about destruction at all. It's a reminder that every divine institution burns, briefly, to renew its orbit. The scholarly debate surrounding comets has always been one of language. Are they messengers or mistakes? Warnings or weather? In medieval theology, a comet's appearance signified imbalance, a rupture between heaven and earth. Modern astronomers laugh at that, of course, but faith and physics have never truly divorced. The Vatican still funds the world's largest meteorite collection, locked in a Jesuit-run observatory on Mount Graham, Arizona. The irony is perfect. Centuries after condemning Galileo, the Church now pays Jesuits to look for alien life. The Black Pope has become the custodian of the stars. You imagine Loyola laughing himself sick in his grave. You close your notebook and glance up. The sky has turned that peculiar Roman shade of violet that exists nowhere else on earth, like bruised wine poured over marble. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wails, then fades. You lean back against the bench, the olive branches above you swaying softly. You think about how the Church has always measured time by fear, floods, eclipses, plagues, and now comets. But fear, when repeated long enough, becomes tradition. Maybe prophecy is just fear that's learned Latin. Your thoughts drift to an obscure Jesuit astronomer you once read about, Father Angelo Secchi, 19th century. He built spectroscopes to read the chemical fingerprints of stars. One night, while observing a comet, he recorded a strange pulsing frequency, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. His notes claim he heard it in the receiver, faint but undeniable. A living light, he called it. His colleagues dismissed it as mechanical error. Yet decades later, NASA scientists detected similar electromagnetic pulses from passing comets. You wonder what Secchi would say if he knew his ghost had been vindicated. Maybe he'd just smile and adjust his telescope, as Jesuits tend to do when proven right too early. As twilight descends, the first stars blink awake, timid and far apart. You walk back toward St. Peter's Square. The dome glows faintly under floodlights, a planet of its own making. The crowd has thinned, only a few pilgrims linger, whispering prayers that vanish into the warm night. You sit on the fountain's edge, watching water turn to molten silver. A memory surfaces, the Jesuit in the Curia saying, "Every age needs its Black Pope." Maybe every age also needs its comet, something bright enough to scare us into remembering that the sky still moves. A gust of wind scatters droplets against your face, cool and unexpected. You glance up, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, you think you see a faint streak of light across the horizon. Probably an airplane, you tell yourself. Probably. Yet something inside you stirs, that same half-belief the ancients must have felt when heaven blinked unexpectedly. You recall the phrase from the tower wall, "Fire walking before the throne of God." Maybe the throne isn't above us but within us, waiting for fire to pass and leave clarity in its wake. You stay until the square empties, until the lights dim, and even the pigeons have surrendered to sleep. When you finally stand, the water behind you ripples once, though no wind blows. You take one last look at the dome, luminous and patient, and whisper the Latin words again, "Cauda lucis iterate." The tale of light returns. Then you turn toward the narrow streets, where the night breathes softly and the prophecy, for now, rests somewhere between astronomy and absolution. The night comes down on Rome like dark silk, soft at first, then heavy. The lamps flicker to life along the Via della Conciliazione, and their golden glow stretches across the cobblestones toward St. Peter's Square, where the air seems to hum again. The city's pulse, steady and ancient, pretending to be electricity. You walk without destination, though your steps know where they're going. The wind off the Tiber carries the faint scent of wet paper and candle wax, and somewhere, a church bell strikes 9. You remember something the Jesuit in the Curia told you. Every age needs its Black Pope. He hadn't said every age deserves one. There's a difference. You pass under the colonnade where Bernini's saints reach outward with marble arms, trying to embrace a world that no longer looks up. The sky above is bruised purple, the kind of color you only get right before a confession. You wonder, not for the first time, how many sins were hidden by faith and how many by footnotes. Your destination tonight isn't holy, at least not officially. The Archivio Segreto, the so-called secret archive, though it's more administrative than conspiratorial, has a rumor attached to it, one the guides won't mention. Somewhere in its depths, among the endless parchment and bureaucracy, lies a small notebook belonging to a Jesuit priest named Matteo Ricci Ferraro, written in 1849. Ferraro's name doesn't appear in church records. His existence survives only in fragments: a receipt for ink, a death certificate signed in someone else's hand, a letter from a French cardinal calling him un uomo di ombre, a man of shadows. The notebook is said to describe the purification of the chair, which sounds holy until you realize that's 19th century euphemism for assassination. The mainstream historical fact that anchors this tale is real enough. In 1848, revolution rippled through Italy. Popes fled, republics rose, mobs demanded democracy, and the Vatican teetered between theology and anarchy. Pius IX, known later as the prisoner of the Vatican, barely escaped Rome alive, disguised as a simple priest. When he returned in triumph a year later, his reforms had curdled into reaction. Somewhere in that chaos, Ferraro's notebook appeared, a Jesuit's record of Operazione Purificatio, a cryptic series of entries that historians now treat as apocryphal fiction. But apocrypha has always been the Vatican's favorite literary genre. You find the archivist's door locked, of course. The guard outside doesn't even blink as you slip a small folded letter into his hand. An old journalist's trick you've learned still works best when accompanied by confidence and bad Italian. 10 minutes later, you're inside, standing among shelves that smell of dust and deliberate memory. The archivist, a pale man with ink-stained fingers, doesn't look up from his desk. "The Ferraro file is restricted," he says before you even ask. "But you're not here for the file, are you? You're here for the story." His eyes flick toward a small cabinet in the corner. You have 20 minutes. Then he leaves, closing the door behind him. The cabinet is unmarked, except for a simple keyhole and a cross carved crudely into the wood. You open it gently. Inside sits a single book, no larger than a prayer manual, bound in cracked brown leather. The edges are singed, as if rescued from fire. You set it on the desk, and the smell of old smoke rises like incense. The first page is blank except for a date, February 1849. Beneath it, a line in Italian: "Dio non ha paura dei traditori, li usa." God is not afraid of traitors, he uses them. The handwriting is careful, precise, the kind of script that belongs to someone trained to confess without feeling. The first entries are innocuous. Lists of meetings, coded references to "our brothers in black," notes on political unrest. Then the tone shifts. "The chair trembles," Ferraro writes. "The one who sits there has forgotten the silence of service. The prophecy nears completion. The black must speak where the white has gone blind." The phrase "prophecy nears completion" catches your breath. You flip ahead a few pages. A passage dated March 12th reads, "We met under the tower at midnight, the comet sign still visible, fading but not gone. The superior commanded that balance be restored. The ink of obedience is darker than blood beneath it, a strange sketch. Two overlapping circles forming an eclipse with a key drawn between them. You recognize the symbol immediately, the crossed keys of St. Peter, altered, one black, one white. The same emblem you saw carved into the wall near the Vatican crypt. You whisper to yourself, "The balance again." There's a notation in the margin, in another hand, "Omnia purgari, debent ante lucem." All must be purified before the light. The ink bleeds into the page like a wound that never healed. You keep reading. The next entries grow fragmented, feverish, almost poetic. "They told me to pray before I act, but prayer delays obedience. The poison is ready. The chair shall be empty for 7 days, and Rome will mourn as heaven measures its reflection." Your hands tighten around the page. The text trembles. The next line, scrawled almost violently, reads, "But I have seen the face of the Black Pope, and he wept." You lean back, heart thrumming. The open scholarly debate about the so-called papal assassin's notebook has raged for decades. Some claim it's a forgery, a 19th century political satire meant to frame the Jesuits as zealots. Others insist it's genuine, though not an assassination plot, rather an allegory of moral purification during revolution. A few fringe theorists argue that the Jesuits were tasked not with killing a pope, but with saving one, by staging a death and replacing him to preserve stability. You'd laugh at that last version if it didn't fit the church's sense of theater so perfectly. You flip to the final entry. The handwriting is frantic now, uneven. They call it the Rite of Seven Shadows. I call it the night God blinked. The poison was not in the cup, but in the promise. The white sleeps beneath the city, and the black prays for both of us. If this book is found, let it serve as witness. Obedience is heavier than sin. The page ends mid-sentence, the ink smudged as though his hand was seized mid-word. There's a single fingerprint on the bottom corner, brown, not quite ink, not quite blood. You close the notebook slowly. The archivist's voice startles you. Time's up. You hadn't heard him return. He takes the book gently, almost reverently, and replaces it in the cabinet. You shouldn't take notes, he says, glancing at your hand, which is still trembling. That story has a way of writing itself again if you're not careful. You ask if he believes it's real. He smiles faintly. What does real mean in a place built on resurrection? Then he locks the cabinet and leaves you standing in silence. Outside, the night has deepened. The rain returned in soft, steady sheets. You walk past the Vatican walls, following the glow of street lamps reflecting in puddles. The city looks like it's melting, its edges blurred by weather and memory. You duck into a small trattoria for warmth, order a glass of red wine, and stare at your reflection in the window. For a moment, the faint lightning from a distant storm flashes, and you swear your reflection is wearing black robes. You blink. Gone. You take a sip of wine and let the burn steady you. The more you think about it, the less the notebook feels like a confession and more like a continuation, a pattern repeating itself through centuries. Assassination or substitution, death or disguise, it's all the same equation. A white pope falls, a black pope rises, and the prophecy moves one step closer to equilibrium. You wonder if Ferraro succeeded, or if his obedience failed him. The Church never confirmed a papal death in 1849, but Pius IX withdrew from public life for months after his return. Some said illness, some said fear. A few whispered that he wasn't the same man. The rain eases to a drizzle. You leave the restaurant and cross the street toward the Tiber, whose black water glimmers faintly under the bridge lights. You remember the diagram in Ferraro's notebook, the eclipse of two circles. You sketch it in your mind's eye, wondering if the prophecy of the Black Pope was never about rivalry, but replacement, one light consuming another. Maybe that's what purification means here, the moment when shadow and light stop fighting and simply exchange places. You lean over the railing, watching the current pull bits of trash and petals downstream. The river has carried everything, ashes, prayers, empires. You whisper Ferraro's words, "Obedience is heavier than sin." Maybe that's the secret weight the Jesuits have carried all along, the understanding that faith requires not just belief, but endurance of contradiction. The white leads in daylight, but the black endures in silence. Behind you, a church clock tolls once, then again. You count the echoes as they fade. Somewhere deep within the Vatican walls, the notebook rests again in its cabinet, locked and forgotten, or waiting. You imagine Ferraro's final act not as murder, but as metamorphosis, the kind history buries under theology. The rain stops entirely, the air smells like iron again, and the clouds part just enough to reveal a single star above the dome. Its light flickers, faint and steady, as though winking at the city that keeps rewriting its own ending. You take a last look at the river, at the reflection of the dome shimmering in its black current. For a heartbeat, the reflection splits. Two domes, one white, one shadowed. Then the water smooths again, and only one remains. You turn away, walking into the labyrinth of streets, where prophecy waits patiently for its next willing hand to write. Morning breaks gray and uncertain, the kind of Roman light that feels like an apology. The streets smell faintly of wet stone and burnt incense, and the pigeons look irritated, as if the weather has insulted their religion. You walk toward St. Peter's Square, half expecting the bells to start any second, that deep bronze heartbeat that divides the city's hours like scripture. But the air remains still, not silence exactly. Silence has a shape, but emptiness, like a chord that never resolves. You stop near the fountain, look up at the dome, and realize something's wrong. The bells aren't just late, they're missing. The mainstream historical fact slides into place with the quiet precision of déjà vu. September 28, 1978, the day after Pope John Paul I was found dead in his bed after only 33 days in office. Rome awoke that morning to still air. No tolling from the Vatican. The bells, those ancient obedient witnesses, had refused to ring. It wasn't superstition, it was hesitation. The official story said the Vatican was waiting to confirm the death before sounding the bells, but the city didn't buy it. Rumors swelled like storm clouds. Poison in the tea, heart attack by decree, divine intervention with a bureaucratic twist. Some whispered that the Pope had uncovered financial corruption in the Vatican Bank, others that he had intended to demote certain powerful cardinals, including members of the Jesuit advisory circle. Within hours, the words Black Pope resurfaced in headlines, half metaphor, half accusation. You stand there now, decades later, feeling the ghost of that silence like a bruise on the air. Even the tourists seem subdued, their voices smaller, as if the square remembers what they don't. You close your eyes and imagine it, the palace corridors at dawn, the marble floors echoing with hurried footsteps, the whisper of cassocks brushing stone. Somewhere a door creaks open, a papal aide knocks, waits, and finds a man in white, motionless, his bedside lamp still glowing. And somewhere deeper in the city, another man in black kneels to pray, his rosary clicking softly like a metronome for fate. The two popes, the living and the symbolic, fused again in death's choreography. A fringe tidbit floats up from your memory. One of the Vatican nuns claimed she saw a faint light flicker in the Pope's window at precisely 3:33 a.m., a trinity of threes. Later, Jesuit archivists dismissed it as electrical fault, but numerologists seized on the pattern, claiming it matched coordinates from the 16th century Jesuit catoptric oracle project, the mirror machine that Athanasius Kircher built to reflect divine light into human perception. According to the lore, the machine could project illuminated text onto walls during prayer. Kircher believed it might even transmit visions. You remember laughing when you first read about it, but standing here now under the sullen dome, the idea feels less ridiculous. Light as message, silence as reply. You make your way through the Vatican museums, past the murmuring crowds, until you reach the room of maps. The long hall stretches like time itself, frescoes of Italy's geography running along both walls. Beneath each map, inscriptions of rivers and saints. You pause before one labeled Venetia, remembering that John Paul I had been Patriarch of Venice before his election. The artist painted the lagoon in shimmering blue-green, dotted with stars instead of ships. The symbolism strikes you, a sea of heaven mistaken for earth. Maybe that's the Vatican's permanent condition. You sit on a marble bench halfway down the corridor. The tourists drift past, their audio guides whispering facts in half a dozen languages. You don't need them. You already know the story by heart. A humble priest from the Dolomites chosen unexpectedly as pope, beloved instantly, dead inexplicably. Autopsy denied, cause of death natural but private. His smile in photographs too gentle to be conspiratorial, yet his kindness itself became suspect. The church doesn't fear sin, it fears transparency. You recall that the Jesuit general at the time, Pedro Arrupe, had been quietly warning against internal rot masked as reform. When John Paul I died, Arrupe said only one cryptic sentence to reporters: "The Lord moves swiftly when his house forgets its foundation." Then he retreated into silence for weeks. The open scholarly debate remains unresolved. Was the Pope's death a coincidence, a divine mystery, or an institutional correction. Every historian who touches the subject ends up writing theology disguised as detective fiction. You think of David Yallop's book In God's Name, banned briefly in several Catholic countries, and of how Jesuit reviewers dismissed it as excessive in imagination, insufficient in obedience. That phrase could describe half of history. You rise and wander into the adjoining gallery, where a forgotten fresco catches your eye. It shows an angel ringing a bell while a demon holds the clapper still. The inscription reads, Quando silent campanae, loquitur conscientia. When the bells are silent, conscience speaks. The artist's name is smudged, his signature erased by centuries of cleaning, but his message remains. You take out your notebook and copy the phrase. Something about it feels personal, like an instruction meant for whoever finds it next. The room darkens as clouds drift over the skylight. You glance up, half expecting thunder, but hear only the faint vibration of distant construction. You think of the bells again, their refusal to ring not as defiance but as warning. Maybe they weren't announcing death because they couldn't tell which one had died, the man, the church, or the balance between them. A legend born among Roman nuns claimed that for 3 nights after the Pope's death, the bells rang faintly on their own, too soft for human ears, but audible to animals. Cats howled, dogs trembled, pigeons scattered at midnight as if fleeing invisible sound. The Vatican dismissed it, of course. Animals, it said, are sensitive to weather. You smile. In Rome, everything is. By evening, the city glows again. Gold bleeding into rose, rose into smoke. You climb the steps of the Janiculum Hill, where you can see the dome and the city beneath it. The bells finally toll for vespers, breaking their long, symbolic silence. The sound rolls over the rooftops like memory made audible. Each peal seems slower than the last, as if rehearsing finality. You sit on the stone wall and listen, and for a moment, the sound falters. One bell misstrikes, a hollow metallic hiccup. You laugh under your breath. Even perfection stutters. You think about that day in 1978, how Vatican radio delayed its announcement for hours, how the reporters outside St. Peter's Gate stood confused, waiting for the familiar toll that never came. The absence itself became a message, louder than any sermon. Some called it human error. Others, especially the Jesuit theologian Paolo Dezza, who briefly served as interim general after Arrupe's stroke, claimed the silence was providential. When heaven pauses, he said, earth should listen. You reach into your pocket and feel the small brass key the archivist had given you 2 nights ago. A keepsake from the Jesuit curia, he'd said, once belonging to the old observatory tower. On impulse, you hold it up against the setting sun. Its teeth cast a jagged shadow on your palm, shaped like the skyline of Rome. You turn it slowly until the shadow aligns with the dome in the distance. The resemblance is uncanny. The key and the cathedral, mirror and lock. Maybe every secret here works that way. Truth shaped like denial, sound shaped like silence. The wind picks up. The bells grow louder, echoing off the hills, overlapping in imperfect harmony. You count them instinctively. 1, 2, 3, 12, then nothing. The silence that follows isn't peaceful, it's expectant. You close your eyes. For a second, you hear something under the silence, a resonance too low to name. Not words, not even tone, just vibration, like the breath of an enormous creature asleep beneath the city. The air tightens, the hairs on your arms rise. Then the wind shifts again, and it's gone. You open your eyes to find the last light fading behind the dome. The sky deepens into indigo, and the first stars appear, steady, unjudging. Somewhere in the distance, another church's bells answer, smaller, thinner, like an echo across centuries. You whisper the fresco's inscription again. When the bells are silent, conscience speaks. Maybe that's all prophecy ever was, conscience amplified until it sounds divine. You stand, stretch, and watch the lights of the Vatican flicker on one by one, each window a confession that refuses to close. Down below, the city exhales. Traffic resumes. Laughter drifts up from the cafes, and the spell of stillness breaks. The bells have done their duty, announcing nothing and everything at once. You take one last look at the dome, glowing faintly against the night, and think how fragile faith sounds when it forgets its own rhythm. Somewhere, the white and the black still orbit each other, waiting for the next misstrike, the next silence. And when it comes, and it will, you hope someone will be listening. The following evening, the city breathes differently, slower, heavier, as if the marble itself has been warned. You wake in your narrow room above the Via Borgo Pio to the faint hum of traffic and the smell of rain-soaked basil. Outside, Rome feels watchful. The air carries that odd metallic tension that precedes a storm, but the sky above the Vatican glows unnaturally clear, as though the weather has been postponed by decree. You dress quietly, your body remembering its own fatigue, and step into the night that doesn't seem entirely yours. You've been told that tonight, if you walk the right streets and ask no questions, you might find the Concilium Umbrae, the Shadow Council, the one circle of men the Church refuses to admit exists, though everyone behaves as if it does. It begins, as all forbidden things do, with a whisper. A Jesuit contact from the Curia, his name never given, his accent an artful blend of everywhere, told you that the council meets irregularly, never in the same place twice, never on the same saint's day twice. They gather when balance threatens to fail, he'd said. White too bright, black too deep, that's when the circle closes. You'd laughed at the phrasing, and he'd only replied, "You think I'm speaking in metaphor." I wish I were the address he scribbled on a folded page led you not to a church, but to an abandoned palazzo near the Piazza Navona, one of those late Renaissance buildings whose beauty has decayed into melancholy. A cracked stone angel watches above the door, wings eroded into stumps. You touch the handle, half expecting resistance, and find none. The door opens inward, noiselessly, like a breath taken in reverse. Inside, the air smells of wax and old wood. The faintest echo of chanting hums through the hall, not music exactly, but cadence, a rhythm between heartbeat and prayer. You move toward it. The corridor narrows, lit by candles trapped in glass globes that distort their flames into trembling stars. At the far end stands a door carved with twin keys crossing over a circle, the familiar sigil of St. Peter, but reversed, mirror-imaged, as though meant for eyes that look inward, not up. You knock once, twice. A voice answers in Latin, "Introibo ad altare umbrae." I will go to the altar of shadow. You reply as you were instructed, "Et lux sequitur pacientes," and light follows the patient. The door opens. The room beyond is larger than it should be. Stone arches rise into darkness, vanishing before they meet the ceiling. At the center sits a round table carved from black marble, smooth as still water. 7 figures are seated there, each in cassock, each wearing no cross, no ring, nothing to distinguish rank. One of them gestures to the empty chair. You sit. The man nearest you has a face like parchment, thin, nearly translucent skin stretched over delicate bones. His eyes, however, are sharp as obsidian. "You've come seeking truth," he says softly, "but truth is an appetite, not a meal. Are you prepared to leave hungry?" You nod because anything else feels impolite. The one across the table speaks next, his voice younger but measured. "We are custodians, not conspirators," he begins. "The Church has many councils, all visible. We are the invisible one, born not of rebellion, but of necessity. We keep balance where obedience cannot." Another adds, "When popes forget humility, or generals forget mercy, we remind them that heaven still listens." Quietly, of course. Rome dislikes volume. You ask how long they've existed. A thin smile flickers. Since silence learned Latin, the mainstream historical fact anchors them in possibility. Since at least the 17th century, the Jesuit Curia has maintained private consultative committees, groups tasked with advising the Superior General on matters too delicate for documentation. Officially, they're anonymous theologians. Unofficially, they're myth. The Jesuits themselves never confirm, yet every few decades, a Vatican letter surfaces hinting at their shadow. In 1942, one such document referred cryptically to our brothers of the Seventh Circle. Historians assumed clerical error. You begin to doubt that. One of the men, older than the rest, slides a folder across the table. Inside are photographs, grainy, black and white, decades old. The first shows a group of clerics standing before a fresco you recognize, the angel and the bell from section 10. But here, the fresco is unfinished. The angel's hand is raised, no bell painted. The demon's face remains blank, unformed. The next photo shows the same fresco years later, complete, signed by a painter identified only as R.M. 1979. The man explains, that painting was restored the morning after the bells refused to ring. The artist claimed he was summoned by a priest who never gave his name. When he arrived, the wall already bore an image beneath the plaster, a negative of the final design. He merely traced what was there. You turn another page. It's a letter, handwritten, unsigned. The cycle repeats. When the voice of the white falters, the black shall echo. When both are still, Rome will learn to listen. The ink is faded but recent enough to sting. You ask the obvious question, who writes these? No one, says the eldest man. They appear. Always in the same drawer in the general's office. Always unsigned. Always correct. You open your mouth, but he continues before you can speak. You think prophecy belongs to heaven, he says. It belongs to repetition. When enough men believe an idea, it begins to write itself. You glance around the table. Their faces are calm, almost serene, as if discussing weather. And what is your role in all this? You ask. The youngest smiles faintly. We're the weather service. Laughter ripples gently, dry as old paper. The humor fades quickly. The leader, if one can be called that, leans forward. We meet only when signs multiply faster than explanations. You've read of comets, silence, mirrors, numbers. These are symptoms. The sickness is pride. The prophecy you chase, the Black Pope, the final Peter, those are symbols, nothing more. The true danger, he pauses, is certainty. A new voice, feminine, speaks from the shadows near the wall. You hadn't noticed her until now. Certainty breeds crusades, she says. A nun, maybe, her veil blending with the darkness. Doubt keeps God alive. No one contradicts her. You realize with a small shock that she wears no habit, just plain black cloth, unadorned. The Jesuits were the first to educate women in theology, centuries before it became acceptable. Apparently, some traditions survive better in secret. You ask how they know when to intervene. The parchment-faced elder answers, when coincidence stops being shy. He gestures to a pile of folders on the table. These are coincidences. You open one. Newspaper clippings from 2013. The resignation of Benedict XVI. The election of Francis, the first Jesuit pope in history. The first black pope to wear white. Your breath catches. We didn't choose him, the elder says, reading your thought. We didn't have to. Balance chose itself. The room feels smaller now, the candles guttering as though the air has thickened with revelation. You whisper the question that's been building for days. Is the prophecy real? The woman answers first. Real and unreal. The same way light is both wave and particle. The elder adds, the prophecy exists because it's useful. Every generation needs a mirror to remind it what face it's making. Another voice murmurs, and every mirror needs shadow to define reflection. You close the folder and look around the table, feeling like you've stepped into a recursive parable. The elder notices your expression. You came looking for an ending, he says gently. The church is built to prevent endings. You ask, then what do you guard against? His smile is faint but kind. The temptation to finish the story. A long silence follows. The candles hiss softly, the wax pooling like melted gold on black marble. Then, from somewhere deeper in the building, a bell tolls once, soft, almost shy. too small for a church but too resonant to ignore. The council members exchange glances. The youngest stands, gathers the folders. The session is concluded. The elder looks at you. You won't remember this clearly, he says. Memory edits itself for mercy. But when you hear a bell that shouldn't ring, listen. They rise as one, each extinguishing a candle. The room darkens, shrinking to a single circle of light that fades as they file out through unseen doors. When the last flame dies, you're alone. You wait a moment, expecting someone to return, but only the echo of your heartbeat keeps you company. You find the exit easily. It's as if the building wants you gone. Outside, the rain has stopped. The street glistens under lamplight, reflecting the stars like a river turned vertical. You glance back at the palazzo. Its windows are dark. No sound, no movement, no trace of the council that might never have been there. Yet as you step away, a faint chime drifts through the air. One small bell, tolling somewhere it shouldn't. You stop walking. The sound is so pure, it almost hurts. Then it fades, leaving only the city's familiar hum. You breathe out slowly. Maybe they were right. Truth is an appetite, not a meal. You walk toward the Vatican again, the dome visible between the narrow streets, glowing like a promise or a warning. The prophecy has changed shape so many times now, you can't tell if it's following you or waiting ahead. Either way, you know one thing for certain: the bells never ring without reason, and Rome never echoes by accident. Rome greets you with a dawn that feels almost fragile, a slow unfurling of gold light across a city still half asleep. The bells ring again, their rhythm hesitant, as if uncertain whether the day deserves to begin. You walk through mist so thin it might be incense escaping from unseen chapels, following the familiar cobblestones toward the Vatican museums. Your footsteps echo softly, though no one seems to notice. The tourists haven't arrived yet. The guides haven't begun rehearsing their myths, and for a brief moment, the entire city feels like a cathedral built just for you. You're not heading to the archives or the basilica this time, but deeper, into a vault beneath the Pinacoteca, where rumor says a relic older than Christianity itself has been kept out of both reverence and fear. The story came to you the night before, slipped beneath your door in a folded sheet of paper sealed with black wax. The handwriting was clean, deliberate. If you wish to understand the prophecy, read what was buried before the church had language to deny it. Beneath the note, a location: Sub Museo, room 17. You didn't recognize the handwriting, but the seal, a circle bisected by 2 keys, made your pulse quicken. The mark of the Shadow Council, their invitation or warning. You never can tell which is which. The guards at the museum's entrance don't even glance twice as you pass. Perhaps you look harmless. Perhaps the council arranged it. Inside, the marble halls are still dim, sunlight diffused through high arched windows. You move past the galleries of saints and martyrs, their painted faces glowing faintly under the protective glass, until you reach a narrow corridor lined with restoration signs. The air grows colder, the scent of cleaning chemicals giving way to something older. Dust, parchment, a whisper of candle smoke long extinguished. You find the unmarked door of room 17. The lock is antique, the keyhole wide enough to fit curiosity itself. You push gently. It opens. The chamber is small, circular, windowless. The walls are lined with temperature gauges and low lights, all focused on the single object at its center. A glass case containing a parchment fragment so fragile it looks like breath caught mid-air. You step closer. A bronze plaque at the base reads only Fragmentum UD 4Q-27, the Lost Gospel of Judas, or what scholars once thought was an early heretical text burned in the purges of the 3rd century. The mainstream historical fact is simple but staggering. In 1978, the same year Pope John Paul I died, a fragment written in Aramaic surfaced from a private collector in Egypt. It described a dialogue of the twin lights, a conversation between a teacher and a betrayer. The Vatican acquired it quietly, restored it discreetly, and then sealed it under glass, where it's been forgotten ever since. You read the translation etched faintly beside the display. The Lord said, "There must be shadow for light to see itself." And Judas answered, "Then I shall become your mirror." The words hang there, suspended in both grammar and gravity. You stare at them, feeling a strange vibration in the air, a resonance that hums in your bones. The prophecy again, always circling back to mirrors, to reflection, to balance. You remember the Jesuits' voice from the council. When both are still, Rome will learn to listen. A faint sound draws your attention, a soft mechanical click from the far wall. You turn to see a panel slide open, revealing a hidden alcove. Inside rests a narrow table covered in dust and a single black-bound notebook. You hesitate only a moment before stepping closer. The cover bears no title, only the Latin inscription ad cecitatem lucis, to the blindness of light. You open it carefully. The first page is dated 1979, 1 year after the Pope's mysterious death. The handwriting is neat, academic, and painfully familiar. The author identifies himself simply as Father P. Arupa S.J. You inhale sharply. The Jesuit general himself, the Black Pope of that decade. His words are steady, clinical at first. The fragment is genuine. The text predates Mark. Its theology suggests a symmetry we have long avoided naming. If Judas is reflection, then Christ is division, light knowing itself through betrayal. The next paragraph darkens. If the prophecy is to be read through this lens, then the Black Pope and the White Pope are not opposites but interlocutors. They complete the same sentence from different ends. You close your eyes for a moment, dizzy. Arup, the man the church quietly silenced after his stroke, had seen the prophecy not as doom, but as dialogue. Further down the page, a passage written in ink darker than the rest catches your eye. I have heard the bells ring when no hands moved them. The sound comes not from above, but from beneath. The stones themselves remember. Perhaps Judas was not the betrayer, but the archivist. Perhaps the shadow is what keeps heaven from going blind. The words blur slightly, whether from your eyes or the humidity you can't tell. You turn another page. There are diagrams, concentric circles labeled fides and ratio, faith and reason, intersecting over a third circle marked silentium. At the center, drawn in faint pencil, is the same sigil you saw in the Shadow Council's chamber. 2 keys crossing within a circle. Beneath it, a final note. When the gospel speaks from glass, the end will not come, but will be remembered. You whisper the phrase aloud. It sounds both terrifying and tender, like an elegy written by someone who understood eternity's patience. A low hum fills the room. The glass case vibrates subtly, as though responding. The fragment's surface seems to shimmer, catching the overhead light and scattering it in strange directions. For an instant, the shadows along the wall look almost alive, moving, bending, reaching. You step back instinctively. The vibration fades as quickly as it began. You tell yourself it's the climate system adjusting. You don't believe yourself. You photograph nothing, take nothing, but every word of Arupa's handwriting etches itself into your mind. When you leave the chamber, you half expect someone to be waiting. No one is. The corridor outside hums faintly with the mundane sounds of maintenance. Mops, footsteps, a radio playing static-filled Italian pop. The world, apparently, is content to ignore revelation. Outside, the sky has deepened to amber. You sit on the museum steps and watch the light bleed from the stone facades, thinking about Judas, the mirror disciple, the necessary betrayal. Maybe that's the church's truest inheritance, the ability to sanctify contradiction. Faith requires treachery the way light requires darkness. And maybe that's what the prophecy of the Black Pope has always been, a dramatization of divine balance, staged across centuries so humanity wouldn't forget how symmetry feels. You recall an open scholarly debate among theologians in the early 2000s, sparked by rumors of a rediscovered Judas fragment. Some argued it was a Gnostic forgery, Others saw it as proof that early Christianity included the concept of dual obedience, one to God's will, one to its shadow. A Jesuit historian in that debate, anonymous as they prefer, summed it up simply: the Church survives by arguing with itself. You smile at the elegance of that. It's the same rhythm the prophecy keeps repeating, dressed in different metaphors: light and shadow, white and black, truth and obedience. The bells ring again, late, uneven, echoing through the damp air. You count the chimes. 11. Too few for the hour. You freeze, remembering what the archivist said. When you hear a bell that shouldn't ring, listen. The last note hangs too long, fading not upward but downward, as though sinking through stone. You glance toward the basilica. For a split second, you think you see a faint flicker of light beneath the dome. Low, underground, like a candle in a crypt. Then it's gone. The rain starts again, fine and cold. You pull your coat tighter, mind spinning. If Arupe knew about the fragment, if he linked it to the prophecy, then the Shadow Council isn't protecting a myth. They're preserving an equilibrium that might collapse if ever exposed. The white pope speaks in sermons, the black in silences. Between them lies a gospel that refuses resurrection, preferring to sleep under glass. As you walk back through the square, the wind carries faint echoes of chanting from some late-night mass. The Latin words drift half-heard: lux in tenebris, lucet et tenebrae, eam non comprehenderunt. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness did not understand it. You stop walking. Maybe understanding isn't the point. Maybe comprehension is just another form of vanity. The Church has survived not by solving mysteries, but by keeping them properly unsolved. You glance once more toward the Vatican facade, gleaming wet under the lamplight. Somewhere beneath that marble lies a piece of parchment whispering the same truth Judas told, that light needs shadow to see itself. And somewhere above, in offices that smell of paper and control, men in robes will pretend they've forgotten it. You take one last look at the cross atop the dome, its silhouette slicing the fog, and whisper Arupe's final line from the notebook. The end will not come, but will be remembered. The wind carries your words away like a prayer written in disappearing ink. For a long moment, you stand in the square, surrounded by tourists who don't know they're walking over prophecy. The morning after the light, Rome feels hollowed, as though something immense has exhaled through it and left the air rearranged. The streets are awake but unsure of their own rhythm. Even the pigeons circle higher than usual, uneasy. You walk through the square long before sunrise, when the lamps are still burning and the cobblestones are slick with the memory of rain. The crowd that filled the night has vanished, replaced by silence, a clean, echoing kind that feels less like absence than anticipation. The sky above the dome glows faintly, that gray-blue hour when the world hasn't yet decided what kind of day it will become. Inside the basilica, the guards don't stop you. They move as if half asleep, speaking in whispers even to each other. The nave smells of damp incense and old marble, and the floor reflects the faint shimmer of candles left burning through the night. You find your way toward the altar without thinking. The great canopy towers above you, Bernini's bronze tendrils stretching upward like the last gesture of something that never wanted to end. You stand beneath it and wait for the familiar bell. None comes. The mainstream historical fact is that conclaves conclude in ceremony, proclamation, name, smoke, jubilation. But this time there was no name, no smoke, only that inexplicable light that turned stone into sunrise. The Vatican has issued no statement. News networks replay the footage endlessly. Frames of illumination, voices of speculation, silence from authority. Theologians fill the air with their own explanations: divine interference, cosmic coincidence, atmospheric optics. Yet you know, as everyone who was there knows, that none of it quite fits. The dome glowed from within. The light moved like breath. You sit on a pew, letting the cold of the marble seep through your coat. For the first time in days, you realize how tired you are. All the fragments of the prophecy, Malachi's list, the eternal ink, the council, the comet, the bells, have converged here, quiet and complete. You open your notebook, now soaked and warped from rain, and read what you've written over these weeks. The pages tremble slightly, but the ink, ordinary, mortal ink, holds. Beneath your last entry, new words have appeared in a faint gray sheen. Sic transit lux. So passes the light. You touch the phrase. The paper is warm. A voice interrupts you, soft but firm. It writes you back now, doesn't it? You turn to find Sister Helena, her black coat buttoned against the chill. She sits beside you, her gaze fixed on the altar. "You've carried too many of our ghosts," she says. "The story is finished." You shake your head. "No, the prophecy said the end would be remembered, not completed." She smiles. "Exactly. Remembering is how God breathes." She stands, gestures for you to follow. You walk with her through a side corridor few tourists ever see. At its end, a small door opens into the crypts. The air grows colder, older. Candles flicker along narrow aisles lined with tombs, marble names of centuries stacked like scripture. Helena leads you deeper until you reach a small alcove sealed by iron bars. Behind them, a slab of stone bears no inscription, only a single sigil carved faintly, 2 keys crossing within a circle. The same mark that has followed you from the council to the manuscript to the ink. "This was sealed 2 nights ago," Helena says quietly. "The workmen thought it a coincidence." A blank tomb appeared where none had been listed. You stare through the bars. The stone glows faintly with that same impossible light, pulsing like a heartbeat. "They think it's empty?" you ask. "Perhaps," she says. "Or perhaps it's writing something new." You remember Cardinal Ortega's trembling voice. The system chose a name that wasn't on the list. Petrus Romanus. Maybe this is where the name chose to rest, in symbol, not in flesh. The final pope, not as person but as memory. The church rewriting itself into silence. You whisper, "The end is not the end." Helena nods. "No, it's a comma. The longest one ever written." For a while, neither of you speak. The silence hums, faintly alive, like a distant choir breathing between verses. Then Helena says, "Do you know why the prophecy terrified them?" You shake your head. "Because it was never about destruction," she says. "It was about reflection." The church feared seeing itself clearly. That's always been apocalypse enough. You reach through the bars, fingertips brushing the cold stone. The light inside it brightens briefly, enough to reveal shallow lines carved beneath the surface. Words too small to read, but forming a pattern you recognize. Circles intersecting, the geometry of equilibrium. The same pattern that appeared in the eternal ink, the same one the comet traced across the sky. Everything folding into symmetry. Helena whispers, "It's closing now." The circle. The ink stops rewriting when the story learns its rhythm again. You ask what happens to those who read it. "We fade back into the margin," she says simply, like all commentary. You laugh quietly, though it sounds like relief more than humor. "Then what's left?" She glances upward. Silence. The purest language. You leave the crypt together. Outside, dawn finally commits to color, the first sunlight breaking through the mist. The square fills slowly with people who don't know they're witnessing an ending disguised as a beginning. The fountains shimmer, pigeons return, cameras click. The world keeps pretending to be ordinary. As you cross the threshold back into daylight, you feel a sudden weight in your pocket. You reach inside and pull out your pen, the same one you've carried since your first night in the archives. Its metal casing is cool, slick, but the ink inside glows faintly blue, the same shade as the eternal ink beneath the basilica. You click it open, expecting nothing, and instead the pen writes on its own across your damp notebook. Finis non est finis. You don't fight it, you just let it write. Helena watches, her face soft with something like pity or admiration. "It wants you to remember," she says. "That's all prophecy ever wanted." She turns away, walking back toward the colonnade, her silhouette swallowed by light. You remain in the square until the bells begin again. 12 peals, perfect and unbroken, the sound pure enough to still your thoughts. Each chime feels slower, heavier, like punctuation drawn out for emphasis. By the final toll, the crowd has stopped moving. Even the fountains seem to pause between drops. And then it happens. Not light this time, not spectacle, just stillness. A hush so complete it feels physical, pressing gently against your skin. Every breath in the square aligns, every heartbeat sinks, and for a single impossible moment, the city breathes as one. No division, no shadow, no prophecy, just equilibrium. The silence you've been chasing finally arrives, not empty, but full, layered with all the echoes that came before. You close your eyes. You can almost hear the eternal ink beneath the earth drying for the first time, sealing its last sentence. Somewhere below, in the crypt, the faint light inside the unmarked tomb fades, its glow settling into sleep. The circle has written itself closed. When you open your eyes again, the world is perfectly ordinary. The square bustles, tourists chatter, vendors open umbrellas. The dome gleams in the sun, innocent as ever. You look down at your notebook. The pages are blank, every word, every note erased except for one line at the bottom of the last page, still damp, still shimmering, et lux sequitur patiens, and light follows the patient. You breathe in the quiet, deep and slow. The prophecy has ended exactly where it began, with balance restored, with shadow learning to pray for light. You smile, though you're not sure why. Perhaps because endings like faith are only stories we tell until we can sleep again. You close the notebook gently, tuck it into your coat, and start walking away from the square. Behind you, the bells ring once more. Soft, certain, merciful. They sound not like warning or victory, but like a lullaby. The streets grow warmer with morning. Coffee scents drift through open doors. Life resumes its untheological pace. You walk until the dome is just another curve of sky behind rooftops. For the first time in weeks, your steps feel light. The city exhales around you, unburdened, alive. You whisper to yourself the only benediction that feels true. Finis non est finis. The end is not the end. The wind carries it away, scattering it into sunlight. The prophecy sleeps. The ink rests. Rome remembers. End of script. Sweet dreams.